Millions watched it live. But none of them saw the real story until the footage leaked. This isn't about a celebrity. It's about what happens when someone refuses to be scripted and what it reveals about the people who hold the microphone. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The studio lights softened into a low amber glow as the audience settled into their seats. There was a usual pre-show buzz. Phones on silent, murmurs about the guest list, polite laughter. But beneath it all, something was different tonight. Maybe it was the weight of the name on the call sheet. Maybe it was the energy of the man waiting backstage. Then the voice came over the speaker. Please welcome Arnold Schwarzenegger. The crowd erupted, but not in the wild frenzy of a pop star entrance. It was a reverence reserved for someone larger than fame. Arnold walked out slowly, wearing a dark suit with an understated American flag pin, his steps deliberate, posture unshaken. The applause didn't drown him out. It flowed around him like waves lapping at a granite cliff. He reached the center of the stage and shook Stephen Colbert's hand. Firm, measured, no showmanship, no attempt to outshine. Just two men standing at the intersection of legacy and media. Colbert gestured toward the guest chair, and Arnold took his seat, folding one ankle gently over the other, back straight. Arnold, thank you for being here. Colbert opened, his voice smooth with the usual late-night cadence. It's been a while. I thought we lost you to politics forever. Arnold gave a subtle smile. I always come back, he said, voice gravelly but calm. A few audience members chuckled. Colbert leaned in, delighted. Of course you do, like a good sequel. They exchanged a few lines about his time as governor, a joke about his accent never softening. Even after decades, the crowd laughed politely. The atmosphere was light, the rhythm practiced. Then Colbert shifted. You've got a new documentary, he said, clicking the remote as a short clip played on the screen behind them. Scenes of bricklayers, immigrants arriving by boat, and young Arnold hauling cinder blocks flickered across the screen. It's called Foundations, Colbert continued. It's about your early days, before the fame, before the muscle, before the governor's mansion. You call it a love letter to labor. Tell me about that. Arnold nodded slowly. It's not about nostalgia. It's about gratitude. I built a lot with my hands before I ever lifted a trophy. And I never forgot that feeling. Dust on your face, your shirt soaked before noon, the sound of tools instead of applause. There was a pause. The audience listened, drawn in by the quiet dignity of the words. Colbert smiled, then tilted his head. That's very poetic, he said, resting his hand on his desk. But let me ask, do you ever feel like you're romanticizing that struggle a little too much? Arnold's eyes didn't flinch. What do you mean? Colbert raised his eyebrows. I mean, it's been a long time since you carried bricks, right? You live in Brentwood. You fly private. You speak about hard work. But do you ever feel like that narrative is convenient? A ripple went through the crowd. Not audible, but felt. The rhythm of polite banter had been interrupted. Arnold didn't shift in his seat. He didn't glance at the camera or the crowd. He simply replied, Convenience is forgetting where you came from, not remembering it. Colbert smiled, but the corners of his eyes tightened. But you are aware, he said carefully, that to some people watching, especially younger viewers, it might sound like a millionaire telling them to pull themselves up by the bootstraps while sitting in a designer suit. Arnold tilted his head slightly. And what would you prefer I say? That I woke up rich? That my life started in English? I talk about labor because I lived it, not because I want applause, but because it taught me everything I value now. Another pause, this one heavier. Colbert nodded slowly. I just think there's a line between honoring your past and commodifying it. Arnold looked at him, expression unchanged. Some people run from their past. I carry mine like a brick, because I know what it costs. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was earned. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay still. The tension wasn't loud, but it had entered the room, sat between them, and settled in. Colbert adjusted his tie. All right, he said with a half smile, reaching for his blue card. Let's talk about the documentary itself. What inspired it, who you work with, but the spark had already changed. The energy had shifted. Something was cracking under the surface. Not yet broken, but not as safe as before. And the night was only just beginning. Colbert flipped to the next card on his desk. The corners of his mouth tugged into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know, Arnold," he said, voice light but pointed, "I've always been curious about your accent. After all these years, you still sound like you just stepped off the boat." The audience chuckled, nervous, unsure whether it was safe to laugh. Arnold didn't react. His face remained neutral, eyes focused. "That boat brought me to a place where I could build something," he said calmly. "I never wanted to erase the journey, just to sound like everyone else." Colbert raised an eyebrow, amused. "Well, it definitely adds character. It's like if Siri had a Terminator setting." This time, the laughter was louder. The cameras panned briefly to the crowd, showing a few hesitant smiles, a few glances exchanged. Arnold waited until the noise settled. Then, "I worked too hard to be reduced to a punchline." He said it without anger, without volume, but the words struck with surgical precision. Colbert's fingers drummed once on the desk. He shifted his tone. Okay. No harm meant. Let's pivot a bit." He glanced at the next card, but ignored it. "You've often talked about discipline. Waking up at 5 a.m., still training every day, still doing your to-do lists on paper. Is that real or is that just branding?" Arnold's reply came without delay. "It's real because I need it. Structure isn't for the camera. It's for the mirror." Colbert leaned forward. "But isn't that a little much? I mean, let's be honest. No one needs to be up at 5 unless they're milking cows or dodging guilt." The audience laughed again, louder this time. But it wasn't universal. Some faces in the front row didn't smile. A woman in a blazer looked down. A man in a military veteran cap furrowed his brow. Arnold didn't smile. "You joke because it makes you feel above the habit. But habits built everything I have." Colbert's smile froze, just a second too long. "You don't think that's a bit rigid? Maybe even performative?" Arnold's eyes narrowed slightly. "Performative is pretending this desk gives you power. I've seen real power. It's quiet. It doesn't need an audience." A flicker of silence passed over the room. The air conditioning kicked in, barely audible over the soft murmur of unease. Colbert crossed one leg over the other, resetting his posture. "So you're saying late-night hosts don't work hard?" "I'm saying some people build walls. Some build spotlights." The line hung in the air. A technician backstage missed his cue, frozen by the tension. The camera light stayed red, but no one noticed. All eyes were on Arnold. Even the band had gone still. Colbert picked up his mug, took a sip, set it down too quickly. "You know," he said more quietly now, "people like hearing about grit, about hard beginnings, but it starts to feel rehearsed, especially coming from someone who's been rich longer than most of us have been alive." Arnold finally looked at him, full and direct. "And yet, you rehearsed this show down to the second. Every laugh, every light. Don't talk to me about scripted. I earned my lines with blood and cement." There was no laugh track, no applause, just air, heavy and tense, like before a storm. Colbert blinked, regrouping. "All right, let's lighten the mood a bit." He turned to the audience. "Did you know Arnold once drove a tank through a brick wall just to teach a kid about responsibility?" True story. There was polite laughter. The story was real, but the timing made it feel like a distraction, a shield. Arnold didn't play along. He simply said, "That boy was a foster child who'd never had structure. I wasn't teaching him about tanks. I was teaching him that someone shows up when they say they will." No one laughed this time. Colbert gave a short nod. "Touché," he muttered, but his smile had disappeared. The card in his hand trembled just slightly. The audience sat still, sensing something had changed. The host was trying to steer the ship, but the current had turned. This wasn't the segment they expected. This wasn't a dance. It was a standoff, and one man hadn't moved an inch. Colbert signaled for a commercial, slightly ahead of schedule. The screen began its fade, the music played, the applause sign lit up. But the room didn't clap right away. because something had cracked and everyone could feel it. The screen returned from commercial without fanfare. Colbert smiled tightly into the camera, but his shoulders held a stiffness that hadn't been there before. The applause sign blinked above the crowd, but the claps were late, uneven, as if the audience couldn't decide whether to pretend nothing had happened. Arnold sat in the same position as before, still composed, unmoved. His eyes tracked Colbert's movements, not as a guest waiting to speak, but as a man measuring what came next. So, Colbert began, the usual ease gone from his voice. Let's talk about identity. He held up a photo, a younger Arnold with a hard hat, carrying bricks across a construction site in Los Angeles. You've said many times that this guy, that version of you, still lives in everything you do. Arnold nodded slowly. He never left. Colbert put the photo down. But do you think that entirely fair? He leaned forward, elbows on the desk now. To present yourself as the everyman when your reality is, let's be honest, far from ordinary. Arnold didn't answer immediately. The pause stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. Then my reality changed, but my values didn't. I still make my own bed. I still write my plans by hand. I still remember what it felt like to be invisible. Colbert gave a short laugh. But you're not invisible anymore. You're a global icon. You're a millionaire many times over. You've dined with presidents and CEOs. At what point does a working class story become just a convenient costume? A ripple of discomfort passed through the audience. Some looked down. Others looked toward the stage, eyes narrowed, not at Arnold, but at Colbert. Arnold's voice remained calm. You think it's a costume because you've never worn the weight. You think it's a narrative because you've never needed it to survive. Colbert didn't back off. No, I think it's easy to sell inspiration when you're no longer part of the struggle, when the grit becomes branding, when the story of the climb distracts from the reality of the summit. Arnold leaned in, just slightly, then asked yourself why your show needs that story in the first place. Why I was invited to sit here not to speak, but to be challenged for remembering. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, confrontational. No one moved. A stage manager shifted nervously off camera. Colbert cleared his throat. But surely you see the disconnect. You talk about discipline and hardship, but you fly private. You wear watches that cost more than most people's rent. Arnold tilted his head, eyes steady. Discipline isn't about poverty. It's about principle. I don't live small, but I don't forget small. Colbert's voice dropped a register, more serious now. But don't you think, especially in today's climate, that promoting that kind of personal responsibility message, while being so far removed from the people you claim to represent, might feel a little tone deaf? Arnold blinked once, only to people who confuse comfort with character. Colbert raised an eyebrow, then chuckled, but it didn't carry. You've got to come back for everything. I've had to, Arnold said. The words hit like gravel on glass. Colbert leaned back, lips tight. All right, then let me ask plainly. Do you believe your story still belongs to people who struggle, or have you simply learned how to profit from it? This time, Arnold didn't move. He didn't blink. He just answered. I believe the people who struggle don't need a perfect hero. They need proof that the climb is real. And I won't apologize for surviving it. A low sound moved through the studio. Part exhale, part disbelief. No one expected the mood to drop this far, this fast. Colbert opened his mouth, but said nothing. Instead, he glanced toward a producer behind the camera, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his on-air composure. Arnold sat still. Across the room, one of the studio assistants stepped closer to the edge of the curtain, her hand resting on the earpiece, waiting for a signal. The crew sensed it. This wasn't just a sharp interview. It was the unraveling of a format, the breaking of an illusion. Colbert finally spoke. Well, I guess we're getting the unfiltered version tonight. Arnold's gaze didn't shift. That's the only version I've got. Colbert tried to smile. It barely held. The camera light stayed red, but everything else in the room felt dimmer. What began as a late-night segment had turned into something else, something heavier. The script had cracked, and the fracture was visible to everyone. The applause sign lit up again, brighter this time, almost desperate. Colbert leaned toward the camera, flashing his practiced smile, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, something harder to name. The transition music played, but no one moved. Arnold sat exactly as before, unbothered by the swirl of performance around him. It was the same look he gave on red carpets and in government meetings, stillness that made other people nervous. As the camera pulled back and the show cut to commercial, the studio lights dipped. Colbert didn't wait for the floor manager. He ripped off his lapel mic with a sharp tug, the tape snapping from his collar. He stood quickly, too quickly, his mug sloshing coffee over the rim. "What the hell was that?" he hissed under his breath, loud enough for two assistants to hear, but not loud enough for the mics. One of them looked away. The other froze, unsure if she was meant to answer. Arnold remained seated. Colbert turned, pacing behind the desk, muttering. This was supposed to be clean, promotional, just 15 minutes of immigrant grit and Netflix buzz. His tone was clipped, breath shallow. Now he's preaching like it's a press conference. A producer approached cautiously, clipboard in hand. We can soften it in the edit. Maybe drop the last exchange. Shift to the lighter segment. We're live on East Coast. Colbert snapped. There is no edit. In the shadows behind the curtain, a camera operator wiped his palms on his jeans. Arnold finally rose from his seat. No urgency. No sound. He adjusted his jacket slowly and looked toward the side of the stage. A production assistant stepped forward, thinking he was leaving, but Arnold didn't move toward the door. Instead, he turned toward Colbert. The studio floor quieted. The energy in the room shifted. Even those who couldn't hear the words could feel the weight of the air around them. Colbert noticed the silence and turned, trying to reclaim his rhythm. "You got something else to say, Arnold?" His voice was a forced mix of sarcasm and bravado. Arnold looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that made most people look away. "I came here to talk about a film," he said, voice low but steady. "Not to be dissected for how far I've come." Colbert scoffed. "You think this was some kind of ambush?" "I think you stopped asking questions and started performing a verdict." A beat of silence. Colbert folded his arms. "This is my show. I ask what people want to know." Arnold didn't blink. "No. You ask what makes people clap." Another silence. A producer signaled 5 seconds until cameras rolled again. Colbert returned to his desk. The smile returned too, but this time it didn't land. The red light on the main camera flicked on. "Welcome back," Colbert said smoothly. "Unfortunately, Arnold had to step away during the break, but we're excited to keep things rolling with our next segment." The crowd hesitated, then scattered applause. But something in the room had cracked. The people weren't confused. They were alert. They'd felt it. That moment. The shift. The tear in the fabric of the show. Backstage, a second camera captured Arnold walking calmly down the hall. His silhouette moved past blurred crew members and set walls, the sound of footsteps soft but certain. A production assistant holding cue cards paused as he passed. "Mr. Schwarzenegger?" she asked quietly. "Will you be returning for the next segment?" Arnold stopped, not abruptly, just long enough to make the silence meaningful. "You have what you need," he said. "The rest would only be noise." He kept walking. Inside the studio, the show pressed forward. The musical guests began warming up. Colbert threw to a pre-recorded comedy bit. The machine kept running. But the soul of the room had gone with the man who refused to fake it. Later that night, the network's social team posted the official recap clip. It showed a smiling Colbert, a well-cut montage of Arnold talking about inspiration, and upbeat background music. It ended with text that read, "A powerful visit from a legend." Comments started pouring in. But beneath the hashtags and emojis, a different thread was forming. One started by someone in the live audience. "That wasn't the vibe in the room," they wrote. "He didn't step away. They froze him out." Others replied. Some posted clips from their phones, shaky but clear. No sound. Just a moment Arnold stood, Colbert pacing and staff looking panicked. What was supposed to be a controlled segment had become a rupture. and people were beginning to notice. The hallway outside the stage door was cold and quiet, lit by fluorescence that made everything look flatter than it felt. Arnold walked with unhurried steps, the hum of the studio muffled behind him. A production assistant trailed behind him, holding his jacket, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Arnold stopped by a corner, then turned. "Where's Colbert?" The assistant hesitated. "His dressing room. Down the hall. But he's in a meeting. Maybe it's best to wait until—" Arnold didn't answer. He was already walking. Inside the dressing room, Stephen Colbert stood with his arms crossed, eyes locked on a monitor replaying the last segment. His producer sat on the edge of a couch, knees bouncing. "We'll get ahead of it," the producer was saying. "We'll call it a timing issue. Say Arnold had another commitment. We'll control the clip. We'll scrub the tension." Colbert didn't respond. His jaw was clenched, thumb tapping his watch. Then came the knock. 3 slow, precise taps. The producer looked up. "We're not taking visitors right now," he called out. "I didn't ask you," came the reply. Colbert froze. The voice was unmistakable. Arnold opened the door. No crew, no lights, just 2 men in a dressing room that suddenly felt too small for silence. Colbert gestured to his team. 5 minutes, he said sharply. They filed out reluctant, exchanging glances. When the door clicked shut, Arnold stepped forward. "What was that out there?" he asked, his voice low, not angry, just unwavering. Colbert folded his arms again. "This isn't a press junket. This is a real show. We don't serve fluff. We dig." Arnold nodded slowly. "No one's afraid of the truth. But you weren't digging. You were building something." Colbert narrowed his eyes. "I was doing my job." "No," Arnold said. "You were auditioning for applause." Colbert's mouth opened, then closed. Arnold walked further in, now standing across from the desk. "You invited me here to talk about a film, but you wanted something else. You wanted contradiction. You wanted conflict." Colbert scoffed. "I asked questions." "No," Arnold said again, voice firmer now. "You issued accusations in the form of questions. There's a difference." Colbert turned away, rubbing his face. "You think you're untouchable, that your story is beyond scrutiny." Arnold's eyes didn't leave him. "I think I've earned the right to speak without being baited." Colbert leaned against the desk, arms behind him, as if creating distance. "People don't want to hear fairy tales anymore. They want accountability." "Then hold yourself to that standard," Arnold replied. "You act like I'm pretending. But you're the one wearing the costume." Colbert stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You play the everyman, the smart skeptic, the voice of reason. But the moment someone doesn't fit your monologue, you turn the chair into a courtroom." Silence settled again, thicker than before. Arnold stepped closer, voice soft now, but colder. "Do you know how many times I've been underestimated? Dismissed? Laughed at for my voice, my name, my past? But I never answer with shame. I answer with work." Colbert stared at the floor. Arnold continued. "You wanted to make a point. I get it. It's your platform. But next time, be honest with your guest. Don't smile and shake hands while sharpening your knife." The knock at the door came again. A stage manager's voice. "Stephen, second segment starts in 3. Colbert didn't move. Arnold stepped back. "Good luck with the rest of the show," he said. "You're going to need it." He turned toward the door. "Open it slowly." Colbert called after him. "You think walking out makes you noble?" Arnold paused, one hand on the frame. "No," he said quietly. "It makes me clean." And then he was gone. Outside, the hallway buzzed with movement. Assistants adjusting cameras. A guest checking makeup. The show carried on, as shows always do. But inside that room, something had collapsed. And Colbert was finally alone with the sound of nothing. Arnold didn't leave the building right away. He walked down a different hallway, slower now, as if absorbing each step. The buzz of the production crew faded behind him, replaced by the quiet hum of electrical boxes and distant applause that no longer concerned him. A young assistant passed him in the corridor, nervously clutching cue cards for the next guest. She slowed when she saw him. Everything okay, Mr. Schwarzenegger? She asked, voice low. Arnold gave her a small nod. Depends on who you ask. She didn't know what to say to that. He didn't expect her to. Down the hall, the dressing room door stood half open. The sign still read Colbert. Arnold looked at it, just for a second. Then he kept walking, until something in him shifted. He turned back. He knocked once, then twice more. Inside, Colbert was sitting alone, shoulders hunched, hands steepled beneath his chin. The glow of a muted monitor washed his face in soft blue light. He didn't look up right away. "What now?" he said flatly. Arnold stepped inside. This time, no performance. No need for camera angles. "You owe me 5 minutes," he said. Colbert exhaled through his nose. "You made your point already." "No," Arnold replied. "I made your audience's point. Now I'll make mine." Colbert stood, arms folded. "Fine. Go ahead." Arnold didn't move any closer. "I've made mistakes," he said. "Big ones. I've been arrogant. I've disappointed people I loved. But I never turned on my own story to win a room." Colbert didn't interrupt. "You think it's easy to stand in front of people who expect you to be something perfect? Who think you're either a machine or a punchline? But I stood anyway, because that's what you do when you come from where I come from." Colbert shifted, uneasy. "I didn't say you weren't real. You implied it with every joke, with every smirk between questions, with every sentence that was less about asking and more about trapping." Colbert's mouth tightened. Arnold's voice lowered. "I built a life brick by brick. And every time someone laughed at my voice or doubted my mind, I remembered the silence of people who never got the chance." He paused, just long enough to let the air thicken. "That's why I speak. That's why I don't lie about where I came from. Not because it sells tickets. Because it reminds me what not to become." Colbert looked down. Arnold took a breath. "You asked earlier if I thought I still belonged to the people who struggle. I do, because I still struggle too. Not for money, not for fame, for integrity. To keep myself from becoming someone who forgets." Colbert looked up slowly. For a second, something shifted in his face. Regret, maybe, or just recognition. Arnold stepped toward the door, but before he left, he turned back one last time. "You know the difference between us?" he asked. Colbert said nothing. "I act when the cameras roll," Arnold said, voice low and sharp. "But when they stop, I'm still me. Always have been. Can you say the same?" Colbert didn't reply. Arnold nodded once, quietly. "Didn't think so." He walked out. The hallway outside felt colder now. Not bitter, just real. Behind him, Colbert stayed still, staring at the empty space where Arnold had stood. No crew, no noise, just a room full of mirrors, and one man finally seeing his own reflection. The show kept going. The musical guest came on, played a bright, rehearsed set beneath the lights. Stephen Colbert smiled, joked, even danced a little. The audience clapped, laughed on cue. But none of it landed the way it used to. Something invisible had cracked beneath the surface, and now everyone was pretending not to feel the draft. Outside the studio, Arnold stepped into a waiting SUV. He didn't wave. He didn't look back. The door shut with a quiet thud, and the car pulled away from a curb. Through the tinted windows, the glow of the studio began to fade. Inside, he didn't speak. Just sat back, eyes out the window, breathing steady. His phone buzzed. A message from someone who had seen it live. Just one sentence. "You didn't flinch." Arnold stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it. He didn't need the headlines. He didn't care about the spin. What needed to be said had been said, and what mattered now would happen in silence. Back inside, the crew packed up the set. A junior lighting tech leaned toward a colleague. "Was that real?" he whispered. "All of it." The other man didn't answer, just nodded once. Quietly, in the green room, the next guest, a young actress preparing for her first late-night debut, sat motionless. Her hands clutched note cards, now forgotten. She turned to her publicist. "Should I still go on?" The publicist hesitated. "Stick to the script," she said, but her voice wasn't convincing. "Online, The internet was already moving faster than network. Audience members had posted blurry videos. One showed the exact moment Arnold stood. Another, the cold silence when Colbert returned alone. No explanations. No excuses. Just footage. Raw. Uneven. True. The clips spread like sparks on dry grass. Within hours, hashtags began to form. Hashtag real talk. Hashtag he didn't flinch. Hashtag still me. Some viewers defended the host. Others didn't. But one comment, short and quiet, echoed louder than the rest. I wasn't there, but I felt it. Later that night, Colbert sat alone in his office, scrolling, post after post, clip after clip. Some he dismissed, others hit harder than he expected. What unsettled him most wasn't the backlash. It was the footage, watching himself, watching the moments when he reached for applause instead of truth, when the mask slipped, when the room didn't clap. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere down the hall, his writers were still discussing how to spin it, whether to issue a statement, whether to make a joke of it tomorrow. But Colbert didn't speak. He just sat there, the silence around him finally louder than the stage had ever been. Arnold, meanwhile, returned home to his quiet kitchen. He poured himself a cup of tea, the kind he drank before early mornings, long before fame. On the table sat a notebook, no branding, no headlines, just a pen and a list of things to do tomorrow. He glanced at it, then out the window, where the city lay dim and silent beneath the sky. He didn't need to post. He didn't need to explain, because people had seen it. And once they saw something real, they couldn't unsee it. The show had gone on, but something had stayed behind. And long after the applause faded, one truth still echoed in the minds of everyone watching. He didn't flinch. He didn't perform. He didn't fold. He stood, and that was enough.